The cold winter air bit sharply at David Carter's face as he pushed open the heavy glass door of Horizon Bank. Dressed in a simple navy suit that fit snugly against his tall athletic frame, David exuded confidence. But his calm demeanor was a shield. Years of dealing with quiet hostility had taught him how to keep his composure. Today, however, he hoped for a simple transaction. No complications, no drama. As he stepped into the pristine lobby, the warm light reflecting off polished marble floors, David noticed the wary glances cast his way. It wasn't unusual. His dark brown skin and sharp features often drew attention in places like this. Still, he walked up to the counter, his expression neutral, and greeted the young teller with a polite smile. "Good morning," he began, his voice steady. "I need assistance with a large transfer. Can't you direct me to the manager?" The teller hesitated, her fingers twitching as if she didn't know whether to type or call someone. Finally, she pointed toward an office at the far end of the lobby. "Mr. Fletcher will help you," she said, her tone clipped but professional. David nodded, thanking her before making his way across the spacious room. The manager's office was encased in glass, offering a clear view of the man inside. Mr. Fletcher, a middle-aged man with a meticulously trimmed beard and an expensive-looking suit, sat behind an oversized desk. He was engrossed in his computer screen, oblivious to David's approach. David knocked lightly on the door before stepping inside. "Good morning, Mr. Fletcher," he said, extending his hand. "I'm here for—" Mr. Fletcher barely glanced up, his eyes flickering to David's hand before returning to his screen. "Do you have an appointment?" he asked curtly, his tone dismissive. "No," David replied, lowering his hand slowly, "but this shouldn't take long. I need to make a large transfer." "Without an appointment?" Mr. Fletcher interrupted, finally looking up. His eyes narrowed as he scanned David's appearance, his lips curling into a faint sneer. "Look, I don't know what kind of large transfer you're talking about, but we have policies here, and clients with significant funds typically know them." David's jaw tightened. He had encountered this tone before, a blend of condescension and suspicion reserved for people like him. Still, he kept his voice calm. "I understand your policies. I assure you this isn't a complicated request." Mr. Fletcher leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "How about you tell me exactly what you're trying to do? Let's not waste my time with vague explanations." David took a slow breath, his patience waning but his resolve unshaken. "I'd like to transfer $50 million into another account. The details are outlined here." He pulled a neatly folded document from his briefcase and placed it on the desk. For a moment, the office was silent. Mr. Fletcher's expression shifted from irritation to disbelief, then to poorly concealed amusement. He didn't even bother to open the document. Instead, he leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. $50 million, he repeated, his voice dripping with skepticism. "Is this some kind of joke?" David met his gaze steadily. "It's not." Mr. Fletcher chuckled, shaking his head. "Look, Mr. Carter, was it? This is a reputable institution. We don't play games here. If you're looking for some attention, you might want to try elsewhere." The words hung in the air, each one more insulting than the last. Dacre felt the weight of every judgment, every assumption, pressing down on him. But instead of reacting, he smiled, a small, knowing smile that caught Mr. Fletcher off guard. "Mr. Fletcher," David said, his tone measured, "I think it's in your best interest to review that document." Mr. Fletcher snorted, grabbing the paper with exaggerated impatience. He skimmed it quickly, his brow furrowing as his eyes darted over the details. Then suddenly he froze. His face paled, and his hands began to tremble slightly. He read the document again, slower this time, as if hoping the words would change. This can't be right," he stammered, his earlier arrogance replaced by unease. "You're claiming you." David leaned forward, his calm smile never wavering. "Own the majority shares of Horizon Bank." "Yes, Mr. Fletcher, that's correct." The room seemed to shrink around them, the air thick with tension. Mr. Fletcher's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, struggling to form words. For the first time, David saw something in the man's eyes that hadn't been there before: fear. David stood, buttoning his suit jacket with deliberate care. "Now," he said, his voice steady but firm, "are you ready to assist me with my request, or shall we discuss your behavior in front of the board of directors?" Mr. Fletcher's face flushed a deep red, and he stuttered an apology, but David raised a hand to silence him. "Save it," he said, his tone cool. "Let's focus on the task at hand. I trust you'll handle it with the professionalism this bank prides itself on." Before Mr. Fletcher could respond, David turned and walked out of the office, leaving the manager scrambling to recover. The eyes of the other employees followed David as he crossed the lobby, their curiosity piqued by the stunned expression on Mr. Fletcher's face. As David stepped back into the crisp winter air, he allowed himself a small sigh of relief. This wasn't about proving a point, it was about claiming the respect he had earned. And while the encounter had been unpleasant, it served as a stark reminder of why he had worked so hard to get where he was. But David knew this was only the beginning. The real challenge lay ahead, and he was ready for it. David Carter walked down the street, his polished leather shoes clicking softly against the pavement. The cold air nipped at his face, but he barely felt it. His mind was racing, replaying the scene in the bank manager's office. It wasn't the first time he'd been underestimated, and he knew it wouldn't be the last. Still, there was something about the encounter that lingered with him. He had seen the shock in Mr. Fletcher's eyes, the sudden realization that his assumptions had been wrong. And yet, David felt no satisfaction. The truth was, David's journey to that moment had been anything but easy. He'd grown up in a small, struggling neighborhood on the outskirts of Chicago. His mother had worked long hours as a nurse, often coming home exhausted but still finding the energy to encourage him and his two younger siblings. "Education is your way out," she'd always say, her voice firm but loving. "No one can take your knowledge from you." David had taken her words to heart, excelling in school despite the odds stacked against him. But the world outside his home was often unkind. He remembered the first time he'd been followed around a store by a suspicious clerk, the sting of a teacher doubting his abilities, the countless times he'd been told, in subtle and not-so-subtle ways, that he didn't belong. Those experiences had shaped him, made him determined to prove them all wrong. After earning a scholarship to a prestigious university, David had thrown himself into his studies, majoring in business and finance. He'd spent long nights in the library, poring over textbooks and case studies, driven by an unshakable belief in his potential. But even as he climbed the ranks in his career, landing job offers from top firms, and eventually venturing out on his own, the prejudices he faced never completely disappeared. They were just dressed in finer clothes, disguised as concern or doubt. The decision to invest in Horizon Bank had been strategic. David saw potential in the institution, which had been struggling to modernize and adapt to the needs of its diverse customer base. He quietly acquired shares over the years, eventually becoming the majority shareholder. But he hadn't announced his ownership publicly, preferring to observe how the bank operated from the inside. What he'd seen hadn't surprised him. Policies that catered to the wealthy while neglecting the average customer, a lack of representation among upper management, and an air of exclusivity that alienated the very community it claimed to serve. David's encounter with Mr. Fletcher had only confirmed what he already knew. Change was long overdue. As he turned the corner onto a quieter street, David's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out to see a text from his assistant, Angela, a sharp and efficient woman who had been with him since the early days of his company. "Meeting with Horizon Board rescheduled for 2 p.m. tomorrow. Do you want me to prepare talking points?" David smiled faintly, typing a quick reply. "Thanks, Angela. I'll handle the points myself, but let's review everything in the morning." He slipped the phone back into his pocket and continued walking. The board meeting was crucial. It wasn't just about addressing Mr. Fletcher's behavior. It was about setting a new direction for the bank. David had big plans, ones that would challenge the status quo and, hopefully, inspire meaningful change. But he knew it wouldn't be easy. There would be resistance, pushback from those who were comfortable with things as they were. As he approached a small coffee shop, David decided to step inside and warm up. The cozy interior was filled with the rich aroma of freshly brewed coffee and the soft hum of conversation. He ordered a cappuccino and found a seat by the window, gazing out at the bustling street. His thoughts drifted to his mother. She'd passed away a few years ago, but her lessons had stayed with him. He could almost hear her voice now, reminding him to stay grounded, to keep pushing forward no matter what. "Excuse me," a voice interrupted his thoughts. David looked up to see a young man, probably in his early 20s, standing hesitantly by the table. He was holding a notebook and a pen, his expression a mix of nervousness and determination. "Are you David Carter?" the young man asked, his voice slightly shaky. David nodded, surprised. "Yes, can I help you?" The young man's face lit up with a mixture of relief and excitement. "I'm sorry to bother you, sir. My name's Marcus. I'm studying business at the community college nearby, and I've read about you. Your story is really inspiring. I was wondering if you'd mind answering a couple of questions. It's for a project I'm working on." David smiled warmly, gesturing for Marcus to sit down. Of course, what would you like to know? Marcus eagerly pulled out his notebook, flipping through pages of handwritten notes. Well, I guess my first question is, how did you stay motivated when things got tough? I mean, you faced so many challenges, but you didn't let them stop you. David considered the question for a moment before answering. It wasn't easy, he admitted. There were times when I felt like giving up, like the obstacles were just too big. But I always reminded myself of why I was doing it. My family, my community, the belief that I could make a difference. And I surrounded myself with people who supported me, who believed in me even when I doubted myself. Marcus nodded, scribbling furiously in his notebook. That's amazing, he said. And what about now? What keeps you going? David's smile faded slightly as he thought about the bank, the challenges that lay ahead. Now, he said slowly, it's about more than just me. It's about creating opportunities for others, breaking down barriers so the next generation doesn't have to face the same struggles. There's still so much work to be done. As Marcus thanked him and left, David sat back in his chair, his cappuccino now lukewarm. The conversation had reminded him of his purpose, of the responsibility he carried. He wasn't just fighting for himself, he was fighting for everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong, for everyone who had been underestimated and overlooked. The thought gave him strength as he left the coffee shop and headed home. Tomorrow's meeting with the board was just the beginning, and David was ready for the battle ahead. But he couldn't shake the feeling that Mr. Fletcher's humiliation was only a small piece of a much larger puzzle. Something told him the road ahead would be even more challenging than he expected. The day of the board meeting arrived, and David Carter stood in front of the mirror, adjusting his tie. His reflection revealed a man prepared for battle. The quiet confidence he exuded wasn't just for show. It was the product of years spent navigating corporate boardrooms, analyzing financial reports, and mastering the art of negotiation. Yet, as ready as he felt, David couldn't ignore the weight of what lay ahead. This wasn't just about addressing a rude bank manager. It was about fundamentally changing the culture of Horizon Bank, and that was a challenge far greater than any he had faced before. Angela greeted him with a stack of documents as he stepped into his office. These are the updated financials and the board's agenda for today, she said briskly. I flagged a few points where I think you'll face pushback. David skimmed the papers, nodding. Thanks, Angela. Let's go over them quickly. They worked through the morning, refining strategies and anticipating counter-arguments. Angela's sharp insights were invaluable, and by the time the meeting was set to begin, David felt prepared. Still, as he walked into the sleek conference room at Horizon Bank's headquarters, he couldn't help but notice the subtle tension in the air. The board members, a mix of seasoned executives and newer faces, were seated around a long mahogany table, their expressions ranging from polite curiosity to guarded skepticism. David took his seat at the head of the table, his gaze sweeping across the room. Good afternoon, he began, his voice steady. Thank you all for being here. Before we dive into today's agenda, I'd like to address a matter that has come to my attention. The room fell silent. Some of the board members exchanged uneasy glances, while others leaned forward, their interest piqued. David continued, recounting his experience at the branch with Mr. Fletcher. He kept his tone professional, focusing on the broader implications of the incident rather than the personal slight. This isn't just about one manager's behavior, he said. It's about the culture we've allowed to persist. A culture that, frankly, doesn't align with the values we claim to uphold. One of the older board members, a man named Richard Hayes, cleared his throat. Mr. Carter, while I agree that professionalism is important, I'm not sure it's fair to make sweeping judgments based on one interaction. David met his gaze evenly. With all due respect, Mr. Hayes, this isn't an isolated incident. Over the past year, I've reviewed numerous customer complaints, employee feedback, and performance metrics. The patterns are clear. Our policies and practices disproportionately favor a select few while alienating a significant portion of our customer base. Another board member, a younger woman named Clara, spoke up. David's right, I've seen the data too. If we're serious about growth and sustainability, we need to address these issues head-on. Richard frowned but said nothing, his disapproval evident. David pressed on, outlining his vision for the bank, more inclusive hiring practices, better training for staff, and community outreach programs to rebuild trust with underserved customers. He could see the resistance in some faces, but there were also glimmers of interest, even approval. As the discussion progressed, it became clear that not everyone shared David's sense of urgency. Some board members were more concerned with short-term profits than long-term change. Others seemed wary of rocking the boat, preferring to maintain the status quo. But David refused to back down. He knew the stakes were too high. Meanwhile, across town, Mr. Fletcher sat in his office, fuming. Word of the incident had spread quickly, and he had been called to explain himself to his regional supervisor. Though he'd avoided immediate consequences, the humiliation lingered. Fletcher couldn't shake the image of David walking out of his office with that calm, knowing smile. It made his blood boil. Unable to let it go, Fletcher began digging into David's background. He pulled up internal reports, scoured the internet, and even reached out to old colleagues, hoping to find something, anything, that could tarnish David's reputation. It wasn't just about revenge. Fletcher was desperate to prove that his initial assumptions about David hadn't been wrong. But the more he searched, the more frustrated he became. David's record was spotless, his achievements undeniable. Fletcher's efforts only deepened his resentment, fueling a growing obsession. He started to see David not just as a threat, but as a symbol of everything he hated about the changes happening at Horizon Bank. Back in the boardroom, the meeting stretched into the afternoon. David fielded tough questions and counter-arguments with poise, using data and logic to back up his proposals. But he also spoke from the heart, sharing personal anecdotes that underscored the importance of the changes he was advocating. As the meeting wrapped up, David made a final appeal. "This isn't just about improving our bottom line," he said. "It's about doing what's right. Horizon Bank has the potential to be a leader, not just in financial services, but in setting a standard for fairness and inclusion. But that won't happen unless we're willing to take bold steps." The room was quiet for a moment before Clara spoke again. "I support David's vision," she said firmly, "and I think we owe it to ourselves and our customers to give it serious consideration." Several other board members nodded in agreement, but the tension in the room was far from resolved. David knew this was only the beginning of what would be a long and challenging process. As he left the conference room, his mind was already racing with plans for the next steps. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something was brewing behind the scenes. Fletcher's name hadn't come up during the meeting, but David knew the man wouldn't let the incident go quietly. What David didn't know was how far Fletcher was willing to go and how much danger lay ahead.